All of you have been in an airport and you've had your flight canceled. I remember one particular occasion when Steve Mahoney, you remember, he came and he helped us on Cinco de Mayo in sharing Gospels of John out in the park. He and I attended a conference, and this was right after I had spoken on John chapter 4 at a church in California. So we were at the conference. It was down in Dallas, Texas, and it was springtime. It was April. And we had a nice snowstorm. Well, actually, not storm, but we had nice snow showers. I mean, it was nice snow. I lived in Dallas for 14 years, and there are only 2 times I've ever seen nice snow. Everything that they normally have there is ice storms. But it was a nice snow. Here we are at the conference, and it was just great. The weather cleared up, and they said that another storm was going to be coming in, but it wasn't going to come in until we were going to be safely on the plane and on our way home. So what do? I turn in the rental car, and we go to the airport. And as we're at the airport, signs up on the board, canceled, 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 and the lines were huge, and people were grumpy. I mean, they were all upset because they weren't able to go where they wanted to go. And I was wishing that I hadn't turned in my rental car, as I thought, well, probably everything close by is taken up, so if I get another flight, we're going to sleep on the floor here in the airport. So we made arrangements on another flight, and it was going to happen the next day. And as a result of that, we started looking for accommodations for the night. And I happened to see this bus from a motel, and I thought that he was stopping where he was stopping because he had someone specifically that he was supposed to meet there. But he got out and he said, do you want to have a place for the night? So, sure. You really have room? And it turned out they were driving from a fairly long distance because every time Dallas-Fort Worth Airport gets tied up, they know that they can fill up their motel. So Steve and I got on the bus and we went off to the motel. When we got there, we were rather happy that our wives were not accompanying us on the trip. The motel was a little substandard, name brand, but it was substandard. Steve and I made a pledge never to tell anyone where Samaria was, but we needed to stay in Samaria that night. We figured that the Lord must have plans here. And so we went to dinner. And we were served by a young man, and I mean, he was an outstanding waiter. And at one point, just as he was engaging in conversation, he got down crouching low so that he would be talking with us at our height instead of him towering way up there. He was a fairly tall fellow, and he just was a very personable man, and he really served us so well. And Steve said to him, you know, you have been an excellent waiter, and you earned the tip. We're going to give you a nice tip, but I've got a gift for you. And he proceeded to talk to him about the Gospel of John. We had opportunity after opportunity. It seemed like the Lord was just opening up doors. Just all sorts of opportunities developed very naturally to talk to people about the Lord. And we thought about it, we reflected on it, we prayed about it, and we said, you know, looks like the Lord said you need to go through Samaria. I still haven't told anyone where that town was, what the name of the motel was. But the Lord brought all sorts of wonderful opportunities in our life, and the only negative about the whole thing was it wasn't a particularly clean motel. We're told at the beginning of this passage that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. And it wasn't because there weren't alternate routes, but he knew that the fields were ripe unto harvest. His disciples were completely unaware of that. They looked and they said, a night in Samaria. Now, Jesus has traveled all day long, and he has stopped by a well, and there was a woman, and she came to draw water. You see, they didn't have indoor plumbing in those days. And when you look at this picture, this is a fairly typical picture because women like to do things together. But this woman came by herself to the well. She was ostracized. And the reason that she was ostracized because she was just a little too friendly with the men of the town. She had had 5 husbands, and now she's living with someone that's not her husband. She's ostracized, and she comes up and sees Jesus and doesn't intend to talk with him at all. She's going to get her water, and she's going to go back to the town. She has no interest in in any discussion at all with Jesus. Next slide. Now, Jesus presented to her something very important in John chapter 4, verse 10. In 4:10, he said that if you knew the gift of God and who it is that says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. There were 2 things that she needed to know. First, the gift of God, and the gift of God is everlasting life. It's a gift. It's not a good deal. We couldn't even afford to pay the tip. It is a gift. But then the second issue was she needed to know who it was that was speaking to her. Jesus is the giver of the gift of God. But then Jesus would give her, if she had asked, notice it doesn't say in 4:10 if you had believed, but if you knew these things, you would have asked. He would have given you living water. As we contended last week, living water is the message that gives everlasting life. How appropriately named these Gospels of John are. Living water is the message that gives everlasting life. So essentially, he's saying to her, if you knew the gift of God and that I'm the giver of the gift of God, you would have asked the giver of the gift of God how to get the giver of the gift of God to give you the gift of God. And everlasting life as a gift, living water, he offers freely if she comes to understand these 2 things. At the end of our message last week, we noticed that she said, when Jesus talked about the superiority of the water that he gives, "Sir, give me this water that I may not get thirsty again, nor come here to draw." She came to understand that what he was offering was everlasting. And in our passage, she's going to come to discover who Jesus is. In other words, I think that she was starting to get an inkling as to what the gift of God is. And in our passage, she's going to come to understand that Jesus is who he says he is, the giver of the gift of God. So, in verses 16 through 17a, Jesus said to her to go call her husband and come back here. And she said, I don't have a husband. So, when told to return with her husband, she said that she was single. That didn't stop Jesus. I mean, she obviously didn't want a conversation. She wanted things to end. She wished he would disappear. And so, in response, he said, well, yes, indeed, she was single, but she had had 5 husbands, and now she's living with someone that is not her husband. So he said, you have rightly said, I don't have a husband. Actually, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. You have spoken the truth there. Essentially, she's spoken a half-truth to try to end the conversation. She didn't want to talk with him. She wanted him to disappear. She didn't want anything to do with him. But Jesus used that to take the conversation in a little different direction showing that he indeed knew things about her that she never would have revealed to anyone, certainly not to a stranger who's a Judean. And she's frankly quite amazed that he would say this. So in 4:19 through 20, she affirmed Jesus as a prophet. Let's notice what is said in verse 19. By the way, just to let you know, Alice needs my notes early, and by the time I finish my PowerPoint, I've kind of adjusted things a little bit. So we'll just look at verse 19 here, and she affirms that he is a prophet. The fact that he told her these things told her that he's not just someone ordinary. Sir, the woman told him, I see that you are a prophet. Next slide here, or actually got it, thank you. She figures out here at this point that he's at least a prophet. But as time goes on, she's going to be wrestling over how much does Jesus know? And what Jesus knows is meeting her expectations of what the Taheb, which was a Samaritan word for their Messiah, what the Taheb is showing himself to be. She says, I see that you are a prophet. But then in verse 25, she's going to say, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. Whenever he comes, he will explain everything to us. She has had a little bit of time to reflect on things, and she says, you couldn't possibly be the Messiah, could you? He's going to tell us everything, and you just told me everything. And Jesus then affirms that he is the Messiah, and look at what happens when she goes into town and talks with the men. Verse 29, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? She's saying, it kind of looks like he might be. Why don't you come? You're the experts. Why don't you figure out if this really is the Christ? I don't know, but I kind of suspect so. Why don't you come and see? And then in verse 39, now many Samaritans from that town believed in him, that is, that he was the Messiah, the Christ, because of what the woman reported when she testified. He told me everything I ever did. Her recognition that Jesus knows more than an ordinary person is the thing that gradually causes her to start thinking of him as a prophet and ultimately as the Messiah. But then she raises an issue in verse 20. Next slide. And this is Mount Gerizim, on which the city of Nablus, which was known in the Old Testament as Shechem, and which is here in John 4 called Sychar. This mountain, the city of Nablus, or Sychar, is in between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And so she's speaking about this particular mountain, but then if we go to the next slide, we'll see what it is that she's going to refer to. Here we are looking at the top of Mount Gerizim at ruins of a Samaritan temple, and we are looking down at Nablus, or Sychar. And so what she says is, our ancestors, that is, my Samaritan ancestors, worshipped on this mountain, yet you Judeans say that the place where a person ought to worship is in Jerusalem. Now, this may be a distraction. It may be, I don't really want to talk about these 5 husbands and the one that I'm living with. On the other hand, it may have been an opportunity that she was giving him to show how much he knows. Okay, this has been a debate that's been going on for a long time. Maybe you can resolve this for me. Let's see how long this debate has been going on. When, in the time of Rehoboam, right after Solomon, the nation of Israel split into 2 parts. The northern part was Israel, now called Samaria, and the southern part was Judah. And the problem, as it was seen by the leaders of Samaria, was if we have good, loyal people who want to go and worship God at the 3 required feasts, they're going to have to go into Judea, and they're going to be spending all that money there, and they're going to be giving all those offerings. We had better come up with a temple that we can have in our jurisdiction and tell people that's where you need to go. And so there was a big push to have a temple here at Mount Gerizim. And that's gone on, and there's been debate back and forth as to whether this was legitimate. The Old Testament tells us this was not legitimate. This was not the place that God has chosen. And Jesus will make reference to that. Notice what Jesus says in verse 21. Woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will not worship the Father either on this mountain or in Jerusalem. Jesus is looking forward to a point in time where the location of worship is not going to be the main focal point. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but essentially, at this point, what we'll say is worship is supposed to be through Jesus Christ, and it's not going to be focused on where the location is. Temples, physical temples, are not going to be necessary in the process. What Jesus then says in verse 22, you Samaritans, and the word Samaritans is not there, but y'all, plural, worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know because salvation is of the Judeans. Now the word of that's here could also be understood as from. It's the word ek. And I would prefer salvation is from the Judeans. And next slide, we'll get a picture of what is going on. The biblical view, we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Judah. The tribe of Judah down in the southern part of the country is going to occupy a central role and is going to be the line that is going to be the rulership over the nation Israel, and in fact, over the world. And within the tribe of Judah, one of the descendants is David. And then another descendant, the most important one, is Messiah, Jesus, Shiloh. So he is saying salvation is from the Judeans. It's from this lineage because I am the deliverer. I am the promised deliverer going back as early as Genesis 49. On the other hand, the Samaritans thought that the deliverer, their Taheb, the Messiah, the Samaritan Messiah, was going to come out of the tribe of Levi. So you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, and then Zadok, who was a priest during the time of David. And as you know, the Levites were all over the country because they didn't have a land inheritance. And so they pointed to one of the priests who settled in their area up in the north as being the one through whom the messianic line would come. And Jesus is saying the Messiah is not going to be a Levite. The Messiah is from the Judeans. Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Now, let's take a look at Genesis. In Genesis 49, we have blessings by Jacob on his sons. And these blessings are going to be determinative of the roles that each of the tribes would play throughout Israel's history. In verse 3 and following, Jacob rejected Reuben, his eldest son. The eldest is the one that you would expect would be the ruler. And he says, not you. And then he looks at Numbers 2 and 3, Simeon and Levi, and there are reasons in the context for him rejecting them. But then he comes to his fourth son in Genesis 49, verses 8 and following. He declared Judah to be Israel's ruler. And specifically in verse 10, he said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh. And I give a rendering of that at the bottom, the one to whom it belongs, the one to whom the scepter belongs. It will not depart until the one to whom it belongs, Messiah, Shiloh, Jesus, takes it. And to him shall be the obedience of the people. What's the big point about the scepter? Next slide. A king would hold a scepter, and that was a symbol of his authority as king. So when Judah is given a promise that the scepter shall always be in his tribe's hands until the one to whom the scepter belongs, Jesus Christ, it's saying this is the ruling tribe. So now let's go to the next slide, and we've seen this before. Jesus says salvation is of the Judeans. It's not of the tribe of Levi. You're worshiping the wrong Messiah. You've got the wrong idea. And he said that they worship in ignorance. So, in verses 23 and 24, Jesus says, "But a time is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Yes, the Father is looking for such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." Now remember, her question was, okay, you Judeans say that Jerusalem is where we need to worship. And our father said we need to go up here on top of Mount Gerizim. And Jesus says, essentially, if we look at this cube that I have, there are two that are on the lower plane. You could worship either at Gerizim or you could worship at Jerusalem. And he says, the issue isn't between Jerusalem and Gerizim. The issue is, are you worshiping through me? Are you worshiping the Father through Christ? And so what he does is he puts it on a different plane. Instead of the focus being where people are worshiping, the focus becomes, are they worshiping the Father through Christ? If they are worshiping through Christ, then they are worshiping in spirit and truth. Well, then she wondered if Jesus might be the Messiah who would explain everything. And she says, Messiah is coming. When he comes, whenever that is, he will tell us everything. Jesus is ultimately able to say what we pray every week in the Lord's Prayer. We pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a prayer that he would come in his kingdom. Because when he establishes his kingdom here on earth, there will be swift justice. If an event happened like what happened in Aurora, he'll deal with it with the rod of iron. It will be taken care of instantly. His will be done on earth just as it is in heaven. And she says, I'm looking forward to the Messiah coming and doing that. But notice she says, when he comes, he'll tell us everything. Because Messiah will know everything. Next slide. We've been here before. Remember when she heard from him that she had 5 husbands and now she's living with someone, I see that you're a prophet. And then she says, when Messiah comes, Messiah will explain everything. And in verse 29, she tells people, I think this is the Messiah. He told me everything. And many people came to believe because Jesus met a legitimate messianic expectation. What happens here? In verse 25, the woman said to him, I know Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. Whenever he comes, he will explain everything to us. And I think at this point she's hinting, are you more than a prophet? Are you possibly the Messiah? She's reflecting on how much he knows. He not only knows her own circumstance, but he's also able to discern the proper way of worship rather than it being focused on where people are doing the worship. Now, this brings us back to 4:10. He has told her that if she knew the gift of God and the giver of the gift of God, that he would give her living water. He would tell her how to get the giver of the gift of God to give her the gift of God. I believe at this point she has met the second condition. John doesn't tell us about the conversation that then ensued. But what happened? At that point, the disciples came. And when the disciples came, it ended the conversation between Jesus and the woman. But then, we're told in verse 27, just then his disciples came and they were amazed that he was talking with a woman, yet no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Then the woman left her water jar, went into town and told the men. Now, isn't this interesting? She came out to get water. That was the reason she made this trip. She carries water, a water jar, down here to meet Jesus, and then she leaves her water jar. Is she absent-minded? No. She knows she's going to come back. And she now has living water. And what is her priority now? Her priority is to tell people about the one who gives living water. But let's contrast this with the disciples. Jesus, the woman said to people in the town, "Come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" They left the town, made their way toward him. Now, in the meantime, the disciples were urging him, "Rabbi, eat something." So what do we have here? The disciples went into town to get food. And what do? They return with food. The woman comes to Jesus, or comes to the well, to get water. And what does she do? She goes back to the town with water, not with the dead water she was planning to get out of the well, but to tell people about Jesus. But the disciples are so focused on food that they didn't bring any men. She went back to town and she brought men. And Jesus is going to rebuke his disciples for not bringing back people to meet him. This woman has the right focus. She's looking for the opportunity. She says, "Here's someone who gives living water. I need to share this." And what do his disciples do? "We're hungry. Where's the grub?" And they're so focused on food that they don't notice the people around them. And so Jesus rebukes them after the disciples have a little argument. So the disciples in verse 33, in verse 32, Jesus said to them, "I have food to eat that you don't know about." So the disciples said to him, "Come on, fess up. Could someone have brought him something to eat?" Jesus said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." Jesus is focused on what's important, doing the Father's work. And the woman is focused on the right thing, bringing people to Jesus. And the disciples are focused on the wrong thing. They're just focused on food, and they're ignoring the people that need to be ministered to. So then in verse 35, Jesus rebukes them. He says, "Don't you say there are still 4 months and then comes harvest? Look, I tell you, raise your eyes and observe the fields. They are white for harvest already." He's saying, you guys have your eyes closed, or it's like you've got sunglasses on, you're looking at the white fields of wheat, and all you see is green. And you say, it's nowhere near harvest time. And Jesus says it's because you're not looking. You need to look, you need to see. Then he speaks about joining both the sower and reaper being able to join together. He says, "You didn't sow. Others, the woman, and I sowed." And as a result of that sowing, I'll still give you an opportunity to participate in the harvest. Jesus is gracious, and despite the fact that they weren't on the lookout, they weren't alert, they weren't like the woman, he focuses in on their need to be able to minister and to learn to open their eyes and to see the people around them, people who have a desperate need for Jesus Christ. We'll postpone until next week the remaining couple of verses that I had planned to cover, but in looking at this road, it's a road that's closed. Water is covering it. It's detour time. You know, the Lord sometimes brings detours in our lives, and we sometimes don't quite know, why did he do this? Sometimes we get in the airport and we just gripe and complain because the plane we were supposed to get on isn't available for us to get on. And I've learned to start looking for signs to Samaria. How do I get to Samaria? Okay, Lord, if you've set me in this situation, have you done so to cause me to open my eyes and to see that the fields are ripe to harvest and that there are people that you want me to speak to? It's so easy for us to think, okay, well, I'm here in the airport. I guess I need to go find some food. Well, that's what his disciples would have done, right? Jesus sometimes has other things in mind for us. Jesus needed to go through Samaria, and sometimes he makes us need to go through Samaria too. Let's pray.